This is a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. My name is Cully Lord. I'm a land manager and a wildlife biologist here in my home state of Florida. I invite you to join me on a journey as I seek to document the little-known stories told by those who use fire for the benefit of the land, also known as prescribed fire. So come on, let's head into the field and meet the people where the flame ends and new life begins. This is A Step Beyond the Fire, Episode 1, coming to you from Gainesville, Florida this morning, a fairly cold morning. It's the end of January. I'm sitting here overlooking this natural area out behind my property, just enjoying life, having a cup of coffee, and I'm looking forward to this episode because what I want to do is set the stage for you so you can understand what direction that we're going with this and why it's a unique experience to embark on. I've got my socks and my flip-flops on at the same time. It's just cold enough where I got to put those socks on with my flip-flops. It's great. Loving life right now. From time to time you might hear I got some chickens in the background. Old Junior, our rooster over there, has been crowing a few times, so he might join in on the podcast from time to time. So if you hear something funny in the background, that's Junior. So what this podcast is and what it ain't, that's the first thing I want to get into. And my goal is really to, number one, educate and engage listeners of all ages. By making this information relevant and applicable to your life. And that includes educating my own self in this whole process, because I always like to point out to everybody that I'm really nothing more than just a student or a learner of this whole process that we call prescribed fire. And I'm looking forward to that too, and engaging people that have been doing this a lot longer than I have. I mean, I've been doing this for about a decade now, but there's a lot of interesting people out there that we're going to meet, and hopefully I'll be able to bring you there and use that as a way to educate and help you understand a little bit more about the whole culture of the people that do what we do. So the second part of this is we're going to be documenting some stories, and I want to take you into those memorable experiences by not only getting some of this information out there, but documenting it and helping use that as a tool, maybe for even as a, we have this whole thing called the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center that disseminates a lot of information about accidents and other things like that. But we're not going to get into that too much. What I want to do is talk about some of the great things that have happened over the years, like the time I was on a burn and we found a new archaeological site, which was really awesome. Or the time that I was ever really experiencing fear on a fire, and some of the decisions I made leading up to that, and what happened with all that. And I had another instance where we found a body on a burn, which was really scary. But it ended up being a cadaver from a university lab that somebody had stolen from the lab and dumped out in the woods. So there was some crazy, a pretty crazy situation with that. And so those unexpected things, the unexpected events that take place is what I'm going to get into. And we're going to go to the field to meet these people and talk about these things. And finally, really the main number 3 reason of us getting together to do this is I really want to expand our horizons by meeting and really seeing the more human side of conservation. And by doing that, hopefully we can better meet the challenges of the 21st century. Maybe there's a few lessons in here that we'll gain through this whole podcast that, because we have an ever-changing landscape. There's a lot of different things that are happening with conservation, not only in our home state of Florida, but throughout North America. I see a lot of great partnerships. I see a lot of leveraging of resources to help conserve areas, help restore areas. And there's a lot of great science that's being undertaken, not only in prescribed fire, which is a whole world of its own, but restoration efforts that are going on around the country, restoring watersheds and landscapes and natural areas and everything from the ground cover to the canopy and many of our ecosystems that we have throughout North America. And I see a lot of positivity, and what I want to focus on is the positivity. That's really what I want to get at, is keeping this in a positive manner and not focusing as much on the negative. What this podcast isn't is it's not going to be one big giant long story. By engaging people, we're going to do some interviews. So we're going to do a Q&A sessions, and I want to try to help you get to know these folks a little bit more, and by meeting and engaging and then and learning from them and really hearing a few stories along the way. So that's what it is. It's not necessarily one big giant story the whole entire time. So a little bit about me. Yeah, I grew up in Central Florida, in Polk County, more specifically in Lakeland. But I also had a life in the city and a life in the country growing up. And it was really during those times on my mother's property. We had 20 acres out in the Central Florida, in the Pine Flatwoods, surrounded by a 12,000 acre cattle ranch in a little community about 7 miles outside of this town called Wauchula. Beautiful place. The county itself was mostly agricultural, not a lot of development, a lot of very interesting characters I met out there over the years down that area. But she had a farm. There was a lot of animals, a lot of livestock. We had horses and cows and pigs, and we also had a pond that we would catch fish out of. We had a whole bunch of dogs and all kinds of poultry, guineas and turkeys and chickens and ducks. And the geese, you had to watch out for those geese, man. You turn your back on a goose, they'll come get you. And they sure did a few times. But it was growing up on that farm and in that natural area setting that I really began to develop my love for the land, or being out in the quiet, outside of the city limits, outside of the bright lights of the city. And I started hunting and fishing, and I made a connection with who became, for a time in my life, my best friend. His family owned, or they actually managed that a big, I think it was about an 8,000 acre piece of property up the road called the Limestone Ranch. And that ranch had mostly, it was a cow-calf operation. But his family, my best pal back then, Catlin Corson, his family had, they had generations of their family that were involved in Florida agriculture. This was a true Florida cracker family, and they were the most generous, beautiful people that, some of the most beautiful people I've ever interacted with in my life. I just had a lot of fun with him, learning to ride horseback and getting into the whole culture of those people that were working in the cow pens and learning how to rope and ride and doing all those crazy things and working just so hard. Some of the hardest working people I've ever met in my life was those cattle ranchers down in Central Florida. And that's really how my love of conservation and love of the land developed, through those experiences. And as I came along and got into high school, and I am a fifth generation football player. So my father was a big star, a big athlete coming out of Harvard back in the late 60s, and he got drafted by the Dallas Cowboys. And spent a very short amount of time in the NFL, but he's been a great athlete his whole life. He just recently went to Bolivia and competed in the World Championship for the 75 plus age group, and his team came in second in the world in men's doubles. So he's still a great athlete. But my grandfather before him was captain of the Harvard football team in the late 1920s, and his father before him played the games way back before, in the early days of football, which if I recall, it was invented somewhere around the 1890s. So there was some history there, and I got involved in that and had a lot of experiences on the field and in the woods. And that led me later in life to attending the University of Florida. And I decided I wanted to study wildlife ecology conservation because I had this dynamic growing up on my mother's farm, working with animals a lot. And that was really how I gained this. I got into this career. You know, people that work in conservation, most of them don't get into this for the money. It's really a labor of love, and that's what it became for me. And as I got out of college and I started working, I began learning. Actually, let me back up, because I was in the classroom and there was a lot of talk about fire. A lot of my classes I learned in my wildlife ecology and management class that prescribed fire is our greatest, most important wildlife habitat management tool that we have in the Southeast. It's really in North America. But that's what I learned, and I never even set foot on a burn until, I was probably about 22 or 21. The ranchers burned around my mother's property when we were kids, and I saw a lot of that, but I never really set foot on an actual burn operation until my early 20s. And when I got out of college, I decided I wanted to get some fire experience. I said, man, I want to get out and I need to get that experience to get a good job and learn more, because I'm interested in fire. So I went out west to Montana, and my sister lived out in Missoula at the time, and I got on with a private contractor, and I didn't spend a lot of time doing the wildfire gig. But what I did do was get on what's called an engine crew, or you basically are, you and two other guys are assigned to a truck that's got, it's called a Type 6 engine, like a 300-gallon or so water tank on the back of the truck, and you have all these tools and equipment, and you support the guys that are pounding the ground and making lines and working in these very remote landscapes to deliver water to the operation to put fire out. So the first real fire experience I ever had, by that time I'd been on one or two prescribed burns. I remember showing up to this area in Montana. I get a call. I'm on this other job in Missoula, and I get a call. I said, oh, there's a wildfire. You're on call. You got to go. So I loaded up with these dudes I'd never met before in my life, and we drove about 4 hours into the Tobacco Root Mountains. And I don't recall the name of the city that it was near. I'd have to look it up on a map, but we show up there, and the wind is blowing steady at 50 knots, gusting to 70, and it's 13% humidity, which is extremely low. And that fire, I remember pulling into this whole incident command center where everybody had their equipment staged, and I remember watching this helicopter dropping water on this fire up the side of this mountain, and the winds were blowing so hard that you couldn't even stand up straight. You had to hold your helmet, and the fire and the wind was just blasting. And watching that helicopter up there on the side of that mountain, trying its best, they had to land the helicopter because the conditions were so bad. But that was the first time I ever thought, man, what did I get myself into? This is insane. And of course, we didn't try to do direct attack that day, but we had to just wait. So I went into this whole project, this whole wildfire side of things, and saw a lot on my short 14-day deployment out west. This is in the summer of 2012. I saw a lot of things that kind of scared me, but also made me think, wow, this is a whole life and a whole culture of people I know nothing about. I want to learn more about this. And I breathed in ash and smoke and dust and cigarette smoke. The dudes that I was with were smoking cigarettes the whole time, chain smoking nonstop in the truck. So we were breathing smoke outside and inside. By the end of it, I had a cough that lasted for about 3 weeks or so. But I can recall several of those experiences in that deployment. We were in this thing called the Ash Creek Complex fires that were going on during that time. And that was, at the time, was called the most dangerous wildfire in Montana's history. And I recall coming into a different phase of the fire, and we got moved to a different place near a little town called Colstrip, Montana. And we get into this open prairie, and we're assigned to go put out some smokers that were up on the side of this, in the saddle of this mountain near some houses that had gotten burned over. And we were up there, and we had filled the truck, and we were coming up the side of this little open prairie that transitioned into this box canyon. And I remember seeing a bunch of cattle that could not escape the burn. What happened was they all grouped together when the flame front had come through, and there was about 25 or 30 of them that died. And they were all, just their charred remains were on the ground. And I remember it was this beautiful blue sky, and it was a nice gentle breeze, and there was this valley of death. And it really struck a nerve within me that, wow, this is really just frightening how a fire can do, and just so much destruction can happen. So I gained a lot of respect for fire through that first assignment that I got sent on. And when I came back to Florida after that, I got a job with the Florida Park Service, and I got interested in prescribed fire. So there's two different things. We got wildfire, which is really uncontrolled fires that happen under unpredictable conditions. Atmosphere conditions are too hot or too dry. Those wildfires can wreak havoc and destruction and destroy people's lives. But prescribed fire, there was this whole other element that I was learning about, that suddenly we're lighting fires under predictable, controlled conditions to achieve certain outcomes. And now we do that here in Florida for many different reasons. Foresters burn for silvicultural purposes to plant forest trees. We got farmers who burn to recycle nutrients back in the soil. Then we've got wildlife managers that burn for wildlife considerations. Then we've also got restorationists who burn to restore areas. And so learning the nuances of prescribed burning, suddenly it was this aha moment for me. And I'm not a pyro. Don't get me wrong. I don't get super excited at the sight of any flames or any of that. But what became exciting for me is the period that after the burn, the process of rebirth and renewal and regrowth that happens when the nutrients get recycled back in the soil, when the new plant growth comes after a burn, and the food that becomes available for wildlife afterwards. I remember seeing turkeys coming in. This one bachelor group of gobblers came into a burn one time right after we had gotten done and on a winter burn, and they were foraging in this field that we had burned right after. I mean, the ground was still hot. All the grass was blacked out. We had burned over through the grass, but they were picking the bugs that had burned up. I guess that's what they were doing, but they were foraging. And suddenly I realized that the fire is just as natural a part of the landscape as these wildlife that live in this area. And that was kind of the aha moment for me. So I started taking jobs that involved fire. I worked my way from $9.50 an hour as a part-time park ranger up through the ranks. I worked for the Florida Park Service, and then I worked for coastal and aquatic managed areas for the state to get some experience on coastal ecosystems with fire. And then that transitioned to my time with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, where I spent about 7 years working directly on the ground with fire quite a bit in the Ocala National Forest and on Caravel Ranch Wildlife Management Area. Some big, beautiful properties that are incredible places. A lot of wildlife and a lot of prescribed burning that goes on in those areas. And that transition to administration, and then I got involved on the operations side of things. So now I work for the city of Gainesville. That's transitioned over the last decade. A lot has happened, but now I work for the city managing their nature parks, which also have fire-dependent systems. And so fire, as you might have guessed, is our number one, it's really our best tool that we have to manage our natural terrestrial ecosystems here in the state. But Florida's number one in the country right now for the number of acres that we burn every single year. And I feel that this episode 1 is very timely because it is Prescribed Fire Awareness Week, which is a great way of engaging the public and talking more about why we need more fire in the landscape. Let me read you this quote here. This is our Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Florida, Wilton Simpson. Here's what he says. Florida leads the nation in the use of prescribed fire as a safe and controlled way to protect the lands we love and the communities we live in. Prescribed burns are a vital tool that protects our communities by clearing overgrowth that fuels catastrophic wildfires and our natural resources by fostering new growth to keep our forests healthy and biodiversity protected. Florida's Prescribed Fire Awareness Week is a great reminder to all Floridians of the importance of prescribed fire and the important work that land managers across our state do to keep us safe. End quote. So there you have it. Tomorrow is the Flatwoods Fire and Nature Festival going on at Austin Carey Memorial Forest, just outside of Gainesville, Florida city limits. I'm going to be down there at the festival and hopefully preaching the gospel of why we burn and some of the important things that come about through that process. And that's really going to be our focus for this podcast, is talking about the importance, but talking about the humanistic side of it and how it impacts people. The next steps that we're going to take over the next few episodes, I want to talk about, since I'm an operational guy, I feel like the best way I can explain what actually happens on a burn through the 4 operational phases of fire. The first one is planning and evaluation, which is really the time, it's really the phase that determines the success or failure of all fires. It goes through the details of what the burn area is going to look like, what the control lines are, what the personnel you need for the burning, what weather observations are needed, and all those things. And then the next phase we're going to talk about is ignition and holding. This is the time when, how do you actually put fire in the landscape so it doesn't get out of control and jump the lines and get out of the place that you want to keep it in when you burn, when you do a prescribed burn. And then finally, the last 2 operational phases, mop up and declaring the fire out. Those are the 2 critical phases. How do you have to keep the fire after the flames have already died down. You have to keep it inside the burn area. You got to make sure that all the hot spots are out so that nothing jumps the line overnight or into the next day. So I think that's going to be a good way for us to set the stage here to help you as the listener understand a little bit more about what it is that we do from an operational standpoint and how that how that's going to be tied into the stories that we tell over time. So stay tuned. We look forward to those upcoming episodes. This is A Step Beyond the Fire.